Welcome to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother Andre Marie coming to you from St. Benedict Center in Richmond, New Hampshire. Our websites are Catholicism.org and Reconquest.net. You can email me at bam@Catholicism.org. I'm easily found on Twitter at Brother_Andre and on Facebook. This evening's topic is Patriotism and the Conversion of America. And there will be no guest tonight. I'll be doing this all by my lonesome. The subject is one of particular interest to me today for a couple of reasons. One, as I record, it happens to be the feast of the 8 North American martyrs, 8 Jesuits who came here from France to come to the United States in order to evangelize the American Indians, the Hurons and the Mohawks and the Iroquois. And these 8 men are great heroes of the Catholic faith. And besides this, I spent the last 3 days on a pilgrimage from Lake George, New York, to Auriesville, New York, which was the Indian village of Osernanon, where 3 of the 8 North American martyrs, those who were martyred on the New York side of the border, on what's now the United States side of the U.S.-Canada border, were martyred. And those 3 would be Saint Isaac Jogues, Saint René Goupil, and Saint Jean de Lalande. And we went and reverenced the spot where these men were martyred, and we prayed the Holy Mass in the gigantic Colosseum Church that is on the grounds of that shrine. And many of us went also to go pray in the ravine where the remains of Saint René Goupil are somewhere, nobody knows exactly where, hidden. Now, there are several things that we can consider when considering the conversion of America. Firstly, what do I mean when I say the conversion of America? Well, I mean exactly what the North American martyrs would have meant when they spoke of the conversion of Huronia, or of any of the parts of what they would have called New France at the time. They were talking about the conversion of this new land to the Catholic faith. And that is exclusively what I mean when I talk about the conversion of America. I'm talking about the conversion of America to the Catholic faith. I'm not talking about the conversion of America in some political sense, away from liberalism to something vaguely Christian. I'm not talking about conversion to any other Christian sect. I'm talking about explicitly, confessionally converting to the one true church, the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church that our Lord Jesus Christ himself founded. Now, I'm calling the show Patriotism and the Conversion of America. We have to think in terms of what is patriotism. For American Catholics, this is a very confusing thing. Patriotism, there's a lot in what's considered to be patriotism that isn't patriotism. First of all, patriotism is a virtue. The patriot is a man who loves his country. He loves his fatherland. And this means he loves his land, he loves his people, he loves those persons who sired him, those institutions which nurtured him. Patriotism is a natural overflow of the virtue of piety, which is a virtue that begins in the home. Piety would have us to render what is due in justice to our parents and to our other family members. Patriotism is the family virtue on the larger scale. It has us rendering the same thing to our nation, to its government, in as much as it is due, and to our fellow citizens. These things are a matter of justice, which is one of the cardinal virtues. We're talking about the cardinal virtue of justice. Now, over and above justice, we have the theological virtue of charity, and therefore, when we as Catholics think of patriotism, we have to add that supernatural layer of the theological virtue of charity, and in love for our neighbors, whom we are commanded to love by the gospel, we have to have in place a higher principle, and that is the desire to share the eternal life of God with these neighbors of ours, so that we can really love them as we are called to do in the evangelical sense, in the gospel sense of the word. Now, I'm going to give a few counterexamples of patriotism. Patriotism is not a love of the government that rules you, though it does demand a respect for that government and obedience to its just laws. And of course, when we say command respect, we have to have a little footnote there, because when the government mandates something that is unjust or wicked, of course you don't love it. You don't love that command. You love the people, but you don't love that command. It is not an ideological commitment to the founding principles of the nation in which you were born, especially if you were born in a nation that was born of a revolution. A Catholic can and must be a patriot no matter where he is. A Russian can be a Catholic, an American patriot can be Catholic, a Russian patriot can be a Catholic, even if he was enslaved under Soviet rule. The Chinese under Mao could be patriotic Chinamen. The Germans under Nazi tyranny could be patriotic Germans, and that didn't make them Nazis. The French under the anti-Catholic Revolution could be patriotic, and those who rose up against the revolution were, of course, patriotic. Some of them did it for the cause of the king more exclusively. Some of them did it for the cause of the church more exclusively. Both, obviously, are noble causes. And in most respects, those who rose up against the revolution in France did so on both principles, for the king and the church as well. So there are all sorts of ways that we can resist tyranny and still remain patriotic. Patriotism is not a feeling or a conviction of the absolute superiority of your nation. This is a bizarre idea that a lot of modern Americans have cultivated. We call it American exceptionalism. This is a ridiculous phenomenon. We have absolutely no obligation as patriots to think that our nation is the best that's ever existed. And moreover, from the Catholic point of view, if we want to consider history, we couldn't possibly consider the United States the greatest country ever to have existed, because it is not Catholic. And it has never been Catholic. Note I said the United States. There is a Catholic history to the Americas. And I'm hoping to talk about that a little later in tonight's program. There is a Catholic history to the Americas. We have to distinguish between the Americas and the United States, which is a political entity that began in the Revolution of 1776. And has continued on and has evolved politically through a lot of eras into the entity that we have today. We love this country. It nurtured us. It sired us. But the idea that we must believe and that it's somehow unpatriotic or unloving of your country and its people to refuse to believe that it is superior to every other nation, this is a ridiculous kind of cheap jingoism, and it is extremely ahistorical for a Catholic. We can have an appreciation and a gratitude that in this country we're free to practice our faith, and we're free to evangelize. By the way, a prerogative that most Catholics have refused to avail themselves of over the history of the United States. But we are not, I think we're not free to be historically dishonest. And the idea that we are the exceptional nation above all others is absurd when you consider the history of Catholic France, of Catholic Spain, of Catholic Poland, and of the other Catholic nations of Europe. Even in pagan antiquity gives us examples of nations that achieved true greatness and lasted far longer than our nation. So this is just jingoism at its worst. It is not the kind of nationalism that would have us pursue the good of our country at the expense of other countries. That is not what patriotism is. We can think of Joan of Arc as a true patriot, and then we can contrast her, and this, of course, is in the French setting, with Cardinal Richelieu. Any of you familiar with the history of France under Cardinal Richelieu would know that he did a lot of things for the good of France that were for the detriment of other European nations. He always had this axe to grind against the Habsburgs in Catholic France and in the Empire, thinking that what aided the cause of France somehow aided the cause of the church, and therefore we have to aid the cause of France, even if that meant that we France, align ourselves with the Muslims at times, the Turks, against Catholic nations. Okay, this is ridiculous. This is a form of nationalism that puts the faith second and the nation first, and that is an inversion of right order. Patriotism is not a detestation or contempt for other nations. It's not an agreement with your nation's foreign policy or even with a particular domestic policy. Patriotism, to be genuine in a country as large as the United States, which is really the size of an empire, it's already the size of a large empire. For patriotism to be legitimate here and not simply an abstraction, we're patriotic because we love freedom, and other people don't have freedom, which is a joke. That's not true. It's a bad joke. In order not to be an abstraction, patriotism has to be rooted. It has to be rooted in what is local. We have to recover the value of the family, of the local and the regional, of those intermediate institutions that stand between the individual and the state. And the common thread running throughout all of these things is what we call the principle of subsidiarity, which we can summarize in this fashion. The principle of subsidiarity is a principle of governance which says that what can be done at the local level is done there. What can be done at the city level is done there. What can be done at the state level is done there. The regional level is done there. Instead of everything be done from a highly centralized federal government or a highly centralized government in the state. And when I say state, I'm using it in the generic sense in which all of what we call countries are really states. When you have a highly centralized government, it's extremely inefficient, and it tends not to respect the diversity of the populace in the country. Now, when I say diversity, I don't mean it in the sense that modern progressivists mean it, whereby all manner of perversion is allowed and or praised in the name of diversity. When I talk about diversity, I mean the local color and local flavor of, say, New England when contrasted with the local color and local flavor of, say, the Appalachians, or of San Diego, or of New Orleans, or of Seattle. There are different customs, different peoples, different foods, different music, different local. All of those constituent parts of culture are going to be different in these different places, and that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. We have our folk music that's regional. We have our foods that are regional. We have our customs and celebrations that are regional. And these things are the kinds of things that the church has always baptized in one way or in another. That's not to say that every local custom can be baptized. If it's evil, it ought to be eradicated. If it's morally neutral or morally good but merely natural, it can be elevated to a supernatural way. And a lot of church festivals were rooted in some local customs that pre-existed the evangelization of the area. This is perfectly acceptable. So we need to have respect for what is local, but we begin with the family. We begin with the family. We receive the faith locally, and we live it in our families. We speak it in our own languages. We practice in this church building with people from this particular community. The living out of the true faith is what produces a Catholic culture, something that we don't have in these United States, not sufficiently. There are little Catholic cultures here and there, but they are highly localized. The Catholic culture is what ought to impress itself on our young. It ought to form their convictions. It ought to elicit all of their actions and command their reactions to the evils that they see in the society at large. A genuine identity is one that's forged in this organic fashion, in the family and in the local community, which ought to be Catholic. We don't put on and take off these identities like we're taking on and off our clothing. It's not a fashion. It's not a jacket. It's an identity that goes to the very core of our being. And because we lack this Catholic identity, rooted in the family, rooted in the culture, rooted in what's local, rooted in authentic custom that's closely wedded to the church's liturgy, because we lack that here in the United States, we don't have a sufficiently Catholic culture. Again, there are notable exceptions here, there, and a few places, but this and because we're in a dominantly non-Catholic country, our identity as Catholics in this country is somewhat schizophrenic. Okay, we kind of have multiple personalities. On the one hand, I'm an American. On the other hand, I'm a Catholic. And on the one hand, I hold up an ideal of a secular liberal government, and on the other hand, I hold up as an ideal the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ as faithfully taught and handed down and presented by the Catholic Church and lived in her moral code and her liturgical life. In order to not be schizophrenic, in order not to have a split personality, we have to integrate these things, which calls for us to Catholicize this country, and which calls for us to Catholicizing it by Catholicizing the local, beginning in our families, beginning in our neighborhoods, beginning in what's local, broadening out to the state, the region, etc. But if we're not living it locally, if we're not evangelizing locally, we're not going to have an authentic conversion of our country. And we ought to want there to be an authentic Catholic America. There are reasons for wanting this, because we should have true charity for our neighbors. We are commanded by the gospel to love our neighbors as ourselves. And we ought to want to give the gift of the true faith to our neighbors as we are blessed to have it for ourselves. And, ladies and gentlemen, there's no salvation outside the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is the one true church that Jesus Christ founded. It is alone the exclusive church in which we find Jesus Christ, his authentic teachings, his true morals, his authentic worship of the Holy Trinity in the holy sacrifice of the Mass, and in the rest of the liturgical rites of the Church. This is the only place we find it. And in order to live it, we have to live the Catholic faith. And in order to share this truth with our neighbors, we have to want to evangelize, and we have to actually evangelize. And there are different ways of evangelizing. But what I'd like to focus on in the next segment is something of the Catholic prehistory of the United States. And I say prehistory because I don't mean the history of the church in the United States from 1776 on. I mean the prehistory of this continent, specifically of North America, specifically of that chunk of it, which we now call the continental United States. You're listening to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network, radio the way it should be.
You're listening to Reconquest with Brother Andre Marie, seeking that which was lost and fighting for it. Exclusively on the Veritas Radio Network's Crusade.
Welcome back to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother Andre Marie coming to you from St. Benedict Center in Richmond, New Hampshire. Our websites are Catholicism.org and Reconquest.net. You can find me easily on Twitter at Brother_Andre and on Facebook besides. This evening's show is entitled Patriotism and the Conversion of America. So I want to do a very rapid-fire review of the Catholic prehistory of America. And specifically, I'm talking about the Catholic prehistory of the American continents, mostly North America, by which I mean that portion which is the continental United States today. There's evidence in the patristic era that in the 400s, there were North African monks who sailed to America fleeing the Vandals. Now, these are things you can read about on our website. If you have any questions about these things, I should be able to send you links to things you can read, from which you can read more about this. Email me at bam@catholicism.org, and I'll send you the links. When we recall that St. Augustine lay dying as Genseric's Vandals invaded Hippo, which was the seat of his diocese in North Africa, we're left to wonder if these 5th century American visitors were not known to the Doctor of Grace himself. If they really did get here, they would have been the first Catholic presence in our land. Later, St. Brendan the Navigator is known to have sailed here in the 500s, so the 6th century. His account of the journey is in a book called the Navigatio. It was used by a man named Tim Severin to reproduce that voyage in the same exact kind of boat that St. Brendan used. Now, a lot of people said that the Navigatio was fake, or that it was something that never happened, that this voyage that St. Brendan the Navigator describes in the Navigatio was something impossible that couldn't possibly have been done in the kind of leather boat that St. Brendan made. Well, Tim Severin took the Navigatio, took the details of the boat, and based upon artifacts and archaeological evidence and so forth of what these kind of boats were like, he reproduced it, and he found that the technique that they used to make these boats was such that it was actually seaworthy, and he successfully went from Ireland to North America. People used to scoff that this voyage was possible, but Severin proved it to be so. In about 1000, the newly converted Catholic Leif Erikson was in North America. Now, you hear about Leif Erikson in your textbooks, but you're not told in your secular Catholic or secular American history textbooks that Leif Erikson was a Catholic. He landed in what is now in North America, in territory that's now part of Canada, but also part of the United States. Vinland, which was the area he discovered, may have reached as far south as New York City. He named it Vinland, by the way, because grapes could be grown here, and unlike in his native land. Okay, why is that significant? Well, wine is essential for Catholics. At the very least, it is essential for the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass. And that's significant because wine couldn't be grown in his native country, or wine couldn't be produced from grapes grown in his native country at any rate. So you can read more about that. I can send you links to places where you can read more about Leif Erikson and Vinland. In the next century, in 1170, a Catholic Welsh contingent is said to have landed in Mobile Bay, Alabama. They eventually intermarried with the Indians. And there was a presence of suspiciously pale-faced looking Indians with gray and green eyes and occasionally blonde hair, and who used Welsh-style round boats. This is kind of a controversial theory, but there are many who think that the Manda Indians historically are linked to this expedition of Welsh, and I don't have time to get into the history of this and how it is that these Welsh came here, but there are books on it, and I can send you links to those. Prince Madoc was the Welshman who came over, and there are books written on the theory of this contingent being among the ancestry of the Manda Indians. Then we have in 1398 Henry Sinclair, the Earl of Orkney, okay, Scotsman. He's known to have founded a colony in Nova Scotia, New Scotland. From there, some believe that he sent an expedition south to what is now Newport, Rhode Island. There is a mysterious tower that stands in the city, in the middle of Newport, Rhode Island. It's funny because the city sort of grew up around it, and it's typical of those who were built in northern Europe in the 14th century, the time of Henry St. Clair. The tower is defiant of explanations other than it's being built by a 14th century northern European. And of course, a little more than 100 years later, a genuine Franciscan tertiary would land on the island of San Salvador and claim the New World for the Spanish crown, under whose patronage he sailed. Of course, a genuine Franciscan tertiary is none other than Christopher Columbus, who, of course, has practically passed into legend as the man who discovered America. Now, our English language American history textbooks tend to skip from Columbus in 1492 to the failed 1607 English colony at Jamestown, and then to 1620 with the landing of the Mayflower and the Pilgrim Fathers. Sometimes we get a little information on how mean the Spanish were wherever they landed, but we have to resist this historical whitewash of our history. There is much more to the Catholic presence in the United States, in what's now the United States. As early as 1526, the Spaniards had a mission in what is now South Carolina. They named that mission San Miguel de Guadalupe. And in 1528, a Spanish Franciscan was appointed the Bishop of Florida. 1528. So before the 1607 Jamestown colony, before the 1620 landing of the Pilgrim Fathers and the Mayflower, we're talking about 1528, a bishop in what's now Florida. The name of that bishop was Juan Juarez. He was only 36 at the time. This is only 36 years after Columbus's discovery of America. 36 years after Columbus discovered America, there was a Spanish Franciscan appointed as Bishop of Florida. This is 15 years after Juan Ponce de Leon discovered Florida on Easter Sunday. By the way, it's called Florida Pascua, the flowery Pasch, because it was discovered on Easter Sunday. So the very name of Florida comes from the Catholic liturgical calendar. Roughly 38 years before Jamestown, Florida had a bishop. The Spanish didn't confine themselves to Florida. In 1542, the Franciscan chaplain of the expedition of Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, one Father Juan de Padilla, was slain on a spot in a place that the Spaniards had named Quivira, becoming the proto-martyr of the United States territory. I say United States territory, meaning what's now the United States, territory that is now the continental United States. Quivira is known to us as Kansas, where Father Juan de Padilla was slain in 1542 is rather symbolic because it's about smack dab in the middle of the continental United States. It's sort of the center of the continental United States. Father Juan Padilla has never been canonized. He's never been considered. It's mysterious as to whether he died as a martyr or not, because so little is known, at least at present, about the conditions of his death. But we do know that he was slain by the local Indians, the natives. All right. So, but it's very symbolic that he was slain in the spot where he was slain. In 1565, the Spanish founded the oldest U.S. city, St. Augustine, Florida. Admiral Pedro Menendez de Aviles named it St. Augustine, because he spotted the peninsula on the feast of St. Augustine, that is August 28th. Again, so the Catholic liturgical calendar makes its way into place names of the United States. Spain would also found in 1509 a place called La Villa Real de la Santa Fe de San Francisco de Assisi, which translated means the royal city of the holy faith of St. Francis of Assisi. We know it today as Santa Fe, New Mexico. The name has been thankfully truncated to something less cumbersome, but notice that Santa Fe was part of the original longer name. By 1625, there were 43 churches serving 34,000 Catholic Indians in Santa Fe. Before the Pilgrim Fathers landed in 1620, there were Catholic Indians on a thriving mission on this continent. How much of our continental United States saw a Spanish presence, we might ask? Well, Spain claimed the entire east coast, which was explored in 1525 by Esteban Gomez. The Spanish had flourishing missions in California, New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, and Florida. They at least explored Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Virginia, which was Spanish territory when the British invaded it in 1607. 8 Jesuits were martyred on the exact spot of Jamestown in 1570, an unknown and uncelebrated group of Jesuits. And the Spanish were in Georgia, where they gave us 5 Franciscan martyrs in a failed mission, known as the Franciscan Proto-Martyrs of America. They were martyred, by the way, for purity. When they were evangelizing the Indians were listening to them, but when they explained to them that marriage was between one man and one woman and it was for life, the Indians rather resented this whole thing and killed them all. The Spanish also explored North Carolina and South Carolina. Eventually, the people who sent Columbus here, namely the Spaniards, would explore and evangelize half of what is now our continental United States. From 1542 to 1834, 80 Spanish missionary priests and brothers would be martyred, mostly Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits. From the discovery of the New World until 1822, Spain would send 16,000 missionaries to its territories in the Western Hemisphere, many in what is now United States territory. Okay, it's hard to distinguish because we're talking about, they would have considered it all New Spain, just as the French would have considered where they were New France. They weren't going according to our present geographical boundaries. What about the French? So we were talking about the Spanish just now, and in the Spanish century, the Spanish sort of glory century would have been the 16th century. The next century, we see the French at their glory. The name of Father Marquette is immortalized in the American Midwest and in the South. Where I'm from in New Orleans, there's the Père Marquette building, which was formerly owned, by the way, by the Society of Jesus. I believe that they have since sold the Père Marquette building. Père Jacques Marquette, who lived from 1637 to 1675, was a Jesuit priest and an Indian missionary who, with the explorer Louis Joliet, founded the northern portion of the Mississippi River. Not founded, rather. He found the northern portion of the Mississippi River. That river, by the way, had been discovered by the Spanish previously in its southern part and was named by Hernando de Soto Rio del Espíritu Santo, the River of the Holy Spirit, in 1541. Marquette, when he discovered it, he named it the River of the Immaculate Conception. I won't attempt the French. The importance of Marquette's discovery cannot be overlooked. He discovered, as it were, the spinal column of the United States. And in so doing, he opened up a vast territory for exploration and evangelization. By the way, the Spanish had a disadvantage. They were caballeros. They gave us the cowboy tradition of riding around everywhere on a horse. That was difficult when you got to certain territories in the Americas. The French mastered the use of the canoe. and therefore they could traverse all those tributaries of the Mississippi. And if you look at a map that has rivers on it, and you see all these waters that connect into the Mississippi, you know that by the use of the canoe, the Jesuits had an amazing access to this enormous swath of North America through this network of rivers. So we have the French presence here in what is now the United States in the 17th century, going through the River of the Immaculate Conception, as they call the Mississippi River, and its various tributaries. Father Marquette, by the way, I mean, we think of him as an explorer. Well, exploring was entirely a side job for him, and it was entirely a side job that was wedded to the much more important work that he had as a missionary. And he was a missionary, and he had some missionary success. Eventually, the Spanish, or rather the French, in 1718 would found the city of New Orleans, and in 1764 the city of St. Louis, both of which would be Catholic centers in North America. Especially St. Louis would be a huge center for the Jesuits of evangelization elsewhere. And St. Louis, of course, was named after the great French king and crusader, Saint Louis IX. So the extent of the French presence here in the United States is very, very wide. At one time, they laid claim to an enormous V of land that extended its left arm to the Rockies, its bottom part to the Louisiana Gulf Coast, and its right arm up to Lake Ontario. A large chunk of it, roughly the west side of the Mississippi River Valley, plus a little lagniappe, that's New Orleans speech for a little extra, gave us the Louisiana Purchase. So when the United States had the Louisiana Purchase, we bought, or the Americans, the Anglo-Americans bought most of that French V. And the French had explored Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Montana. They re-explored some of the states that the Spanish had already explored, such as Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Nebraska. Besides Father Marquette, the French who brought the Catholic faith and civilization here would include the settlers and colonizers of Canada, like Jacques Cartier, Samuel de Champlain, Robert de La Salle, who brought French settlers to Illinois, and of course the North American Martyrs, those 8 Jesuits whose feast day we celebrate on this very day on which I am recording this, which is September 26th. With this very quick romp through pre-Columbian Spanish and French adventures in the New World, we set the stage for the next part, which is the arrival of the Anglo-Protestants. And I'll move to that, and we'll talk a little bit about that in some of the time that we've got left. You're listening to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network, radio the way it should be.
Your guide to the reconquest of what modern man has lost. Think of it as a roadmap to truth with a crucifix as a compass. Reconquest is exclusively on the Veritas Radio Network's Crusade.
Welcome back to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother Andre Marie coming to you from St. Benedict's Center in Richmond, New Hampshire. Our websites are Catholicism.org and Reconquest.net. I can be found on Twitter at Brother_Andre and on Facebook. And you can email me at bam@Catholicism.org. That's BAM @Catholicism.org. We're talking this evening about patriotism and the conversion of America. The French and the Spanish, whom we were just talking about, strove to make America Catholic, and with varying degrees of success. Sometimes the enemies of the faith won out. At other times, the missionaries scored victories, as with St. Augustine, Florida, Santa Fe, New Mexico, which we described earlier. And by the way, if you want any of those statistics that we talked about in the earlier, some of those numbers that I gave in the second segment, just email me. I'll send you links. And if you're suspicious that I'm actually reading something right now and have been reading something all through this show, your suspicion is well founded. But I'm not plagiarizing, because I wrote this stuff some years ago when I was actually giving a tour across the country to try to get Catholics excited about the evangelization of the United States. Now, in all things considered, our Hispano and Franco-American Catholic forebears did what they could to make America Catholic. But something was in the works that would, throw a monkey wrench in the works. And that thing is the arrival of the English. Now, I speak not with hatred for the English. It's a great tragedy that what was once known as Mary's dowry, what was once a very high Catholic culture in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and of course, who owed her evangelization to the papacy, St. Augustine of Canterbury, being a monk who was in the monastery founded by Pope St. Gregory the Great, and he was sent there on an embassy to convert the English by Pope Gregory the Great. It was a papal project, a Roman project from the beginning, also a monastic project, by the way, from the beginning. It's a very great tragedy that this great Catholic country, which in the High Middle Ages provided Christendom with piles of saints, along with great Catholic universities such as Oxford and Cambridge, a wonderful literature, think the Canterbury Tales, a rich culture, big and broad and beautiful enough for the muses to dance freely with the angels, a culture which kept holy vigil, a culture which saw the angels keeping holy vigil over the Angles. That's the English. In fact, when St. Gregory the Great saw English slaves, Anglo slaves, being sold in the Roman marketplaces, he looked at them and was impressed by their physical appearance, and he asked somebody, who are they? And they said, these are Angles. He said, say not that they are Angles, say rather that they are angels. And when he found out that they were pagan and their homeland was pagan, that's when he got a zeal to send people to evangelize them, and St. Augustine of Canterbury was sent. But what was once a great Catholic nation, which was once known as Mary's dowry, became known in the rest of Christendom as Perfida Albion, perfidious England, as Bishop Bossuet called her, after Henry VIII rent her from the bosom of the church, which is with his horrible defection. England had no use for Catholic Spain, whose armada would have invaded the islands in 1588 had it not been destroyed by a storm. Nor did England harbor a great love for her across the Channel neighbor, Catholic France, whose inhabitants were commonly known in England as, quote, our natural enemies, end quote. An example of this inimical relationship would be James Moore's 1702 and 1703 invasions of Florida, where English Protestants murdered priests and Indians alike, carrying off as many as 10,000 to 12,000 of the Catholic Indians as slaves. By the way, the brutal handling of the red man at the hands of the British would be something that we would inherit in the United States, which committed innumerable atrocities against the natives of this land. And no, you're not a bleeding heart liberal if you think that the United States has wronged the red man. Those who stood first in the defense of the Indians were the missionaries, principally the Jesuits, defending the Indians against the shabby treatment that they got from the United States government. The English were no less problematic for the French than they were for the Spanish. The French in the Indian War, the North American theater of Europe's 7 Years' War, was very much a Catholic versus Protestant thing. By the way, I was just on an historical battleground of this war. It began the pilgrimage that I referred to earlier on Lake George. Indeed, Anglo-America, first under the British and then under the United States, would gradually destroy l'Amérique française, French America. All right, so mention of the anti-Catholic wrongs of the Anglo-American history is not an exercise in demonizing the nation. After all, we should have Catholic hearts to love the English and pray for their return to Roman unity, as the Church has officially long done, prayed for the English to come back to the faith. The point here is to show that our land, whose soil was once purpled with the blood of Catholic martyrs, was hijacked by heretics. God's providence allowed it, but that doesn't mean it was a good development. Perhaps more than the outright persecution by English Protestants was the character of Catholicism that came to the colonies and passed into the States. We had a weak, timid, and very too impressed with our non-Catholic fellow countrymen kind of Catholicism in the early days of Catholic English-speaking America. A sample of this can be seen in the directives given by Lord Cecil Calvert to the governor and commissioners of the Maryland colony. And no, Maryland was not a Catholic colony. That's an historical error. Calvert was the second cousin of Lord Baltimore, the Catholic who in 1633 warned the officials of the new colony to, quote, be very careful to preserve unity and peace amongst all the passengers on shipboard, and suffer no scandal or offense to be given to any of the Protestants, whereby any just complaint may hereafter be made by them in Virginia or in England, and for that end cause all acts of the Roman Catholic religion to be done as privately as may be, and instruct all Roman Catholics to be silent upon all occasions of discourse concerning matters of religion, and to treat with the Protestants with as much mildness and favor as justice will permit. Now, this order that was given was basically telling the English-speaking Catholics to shut up about your religion and practice it privately. This stamped itself on the character of English-speaking American Catholicism, and we're still dealing with this today. Catholicism in the Anglo-American world is a cowed religion. Catholicism in the Anglo-American world is a religion which is all too ready to throw up its hands and surrender to the dominant culture around it. We see it in the clergy, we see it in the episcopacy, and we see it also in the laity. So this is a problem. Now, there are huge historical exceptions to this rule, enormous and very impressive exceptions to this. Practicing one's faith as privately as may be and being silent on all occasions of discourse concerning matters of faith and religion is commonly known as the sin of human respect. This kind of fake religiosity was not just a personal quirk of Lord Baltimore. It put its stamp on the whole new venture. And for the little good that it did the colonists to hide their religion, and it did very little good for the colonists to hide their religion, because eventually the anti-Catholic penal laws were in full force in Maryland. And then, by the way, they had to move those who wanted to keep the faith. The Calvert family apostatized to Anglicanism. Those who wanted to keep the faith that had been in the Maryland colony went to Kentucky, and that's why we have a lot of Kentuckians with old English names. I know a lady who is descended from one of those historical Kentucky Catholic families. Okay, so by 1790, another prominent Maryland family would give us our republic's first bishop, Bishop John Carroll. Bishop Carroll is not the man of the heroic man of great legend, as we have been taught in many of our sort of Americanist kind of Catholic history textbooks in this country. There's a lot to say against Bishop Carroll. And if you want to find out some of it, email me and I'll send you some links. Just over a century later, that same sort of attenuated and timid Catholicism would develop with an infusionment of Enlightenment thinking into the heresy of Americanism. So I'm leaving out a lot of details here. That's for sure. There were great moments in Maryland Catholicism, including evangelistic efforts directed towards the Indians. But overall, the Anglo-American Catholicism that supplanted the French and Spanish cultural embodiments of the faith was of an inferior class. It was just too timid, and we have to admit this because we've inherited it. It's woven itself into our religious and cultural fiber, and we have to acknowledge this problem if we're going to overcome it. Because even if we don't have English blood in us, we've inherited the language, and we've inherited something of the timid patrimony of American Catholicism that came over here on the Ark and the Dove, the two ships that sailed with the Maryland colonists. So we need to work to make this a Catholic America. Again, because there's no salvation inside the Catholic Church, we have to have theological love for our countrymen. We don't hate them because they're heretics or schismatics or non-believers of any other stripe. Out of love first for God, in whom they don't believe, by the way, if they don't believe in the Trinity and they don't believe in Jesus Christ and his church. First out of love of him to make him known, and secondly out of love of our neighbor to save their souls, we have to evangelize. Canon law actually makes provision. There's a right and there's a duty of Catholic laymen to evangelize. If you want to evangelize successfully, put the project in Our Lady's hands. Consecrate yourself to the Blessed Virgin Mary, and you will be a fit instrument in her hands if you live that consecration authentically. If you want to know more about, how do I evangelize? Email me, bam@catholicism.org, and I can send you some suggestions on how to evangelize. But you have to begin by wanting it. If you don't want to evangelize Catholic America, evangelize America, we won't have a Catholic America. You've been listening to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network, radio the way it should be.